Hello everyone, welcome back to the class of macroeconomics. In today's class, we want to talk about the ISLM analysis. So to begin with, in today's class, we are going to address the following topics. We want to talk about how various factors affecting the shifting of the full employment line, how are the various factors shifting the IS curve and LM curve. Toward the end, we are going to talk about how to conduct the Keynesian type of analysis based on the ISLM model. So the outline for today is as follows. We want to talk about the factors shifting the full employment line, then we are going to talk about the factor shifting the IS curve, and then we are going to talk about the factors shifting the LM curve, and then we are going to talk about the ISLM equilibrium. So to begin with, when we want to talk about the factors that shifting the full employment line, we want to again review the properties of the full employment line. So on top of the full employment line, every point represents the relationship between the real interest rate and the output when the labor market is in equilibrium. Therefore, when we draw the full employment line, the vertical axis is R and the horizontal axis is Y. And then this full employment line is vertical, and on top of this line, every point represents a labor market equilibrium. This graph is completely different from the labor market equilibrium graph we saw before. Before, when we are talking about the labor market equilibrium, we also draw a diagram with the vertical axis and the horizontal axis. However, in there, the horizontal axis representing the quantity of labor and supply, and the vertical axis representing the prices, which is the real wages. Therefore, when we are plotting the labor supply curve, which is sloping upward, and the labor demand curve, which is sloping downward, we are going to only have one equilibrium in that particular graph, which is the quantity of labor demanded equal to the quantity of labor supplied. So in that graph, there is only one equilibrium in a graph. However, for the full employment line, on top of the line, every point represents the labor market equilibrium. So then, what else that we know about the full employment line is it represents the labor market equilibrium. However, when we are drawing the full employment line, the vertical axis is R and the horizontal axis is output. So then we ask, will the R be affected by the labor market equilibrium, or how does the changes in R affect the labor market equilibrium? It turned out that the changes in the R has nothing to do with the labor market equilibrium, because R is the price for the goods market and it is not the price of the labor market. Therefore, for any labor market equilibrium, it can correspond to any level of the R. Because of that, the full employment line is the vertical line. In the graph, that the vertical axis is R and the horizontal axis is Y. So then when we want to talk about the factor shifting the full employment line, then want to explore how does the output, and in here, because we know every point on top of the full employment line represents the labor market equilibrium. Therefore, the output that we want to talk about in here is the full employment output. So then we want to see how does the full employment output change when the shock occurs, and then how does it affect the labor market equilibrium, and then the output. So then those shocks affecting the labor market equilibrium by affecting the labor supply and the labor demand, and thus the output. And then once it increases the full employment output, then it will cause the full employment line to shift rightward. If it is the shock causes the full employment output to fall, then it will cause the full employment line to shift leftward. Thus, when we want to explore how does the full employment line shifts, then we need to focus on how does the labor market equilibrium be, and how will that affect the full employment output, and then we will know how does the full employment line shifts when the economy faces shocks. Now let's elaborate what we just discussed in graphs. So to begin with, when we want to look at the full employment line, we say that it is a vertical line on a plot, that the vertical axis is R and the horizontal axis is Y. So then when we want to look at the factor that's shifting the full employment line, we want to explore when the factor or say some shock occur, how does it affect the labor demand and the labor supply. So now let's first take a look at the labor demand. We say that when there is an increase in productivity or when there is an increase in the capital stock, then both of them will raise the marginal product of labor, given that the real wages remain the same because that is the price determined by the market, and by the time the marginal product of labor increase, that the firms are so small to affect the real wages. Therefore, we say that under this case, the marginal product of labor increases given the same level of the real wages. Therefore, the labor demand curve should shift to the right. So then in the diagram illustrating the labor market equilibrium, we have the vertical axis, that is the real wages, and the horizontal axis is the quantity of labor supply and the demand. We have the labor supply curve slope upward and having the labor demand curve sloping downward, given that these two changes causes the labor demand to increase given the same level of the real wages. So then we know that the labor demand curve shifts to the right. So then for this economy, it is going to end up to have a higher full employment level, given that the full employment level is higher, holding all the other things being equal. So then the full employment output should also increase. So then how about the factors that affecting the labor supply? And we want to see how will that shift the full employment line. It turned out that when there is an increase in the labor participation rate, it's going to raise the total number of people that can work, so then it raises the total labor supply. Okay, so when the labor participation rate increases, it means that there are more people entering the labor market. Because there are more people entering the labor market, so then the total quantity of labor supply increased. Same thing happened to the working age population. When the working age population increased, that it means that there are more people available to work because they attain the age that can work. Then for both scenarios, it will raise the labor supply. Because of that, when we look at the diagram illustrating the labor market equilibrium, we know that the labor supply curve should shift to the right under this case. Because of that, the full employment level raises because the labor supply curve shifts to the right, so then the equilibrium quantity of labor supply and the demand raises. Therefore, the full employment output is higher due to higher full employment. How about when there is an increase in the wealth? When wealth increases, people value more leisure, so then people want to work less. For that case, it will cause the labor supply to decrease. How about when there is an increase in the future wages? Well, given that if you know your wage rate will be $10,000 per hour tomorrow, but your wage rate is only $100 per hour, then I guess a lot of us will choose to have a break today and then work hard from tomorrow onward. Therefore, when the wage rate raises in the future, it will cause a fall in the current labor supply. Because of that, in the diagram of the labor market equilibrium, we said that under an increase in the wealth or an increase in the wages in the future, we are going to see that the labor supply curve will shift to the left. Because of that, for this economy, it's going to have a smaller full employment level, thus the full employment output should fall. In here, I want to emphasize a point, that is, the wages that we are talking about here is about the future wages. But then the wages in the labor market equilibrium diagram is about the current wages. When the future wages increase, it is given the same current wages. Therefore, this wage increase will shift the labor supply curve. However, if it is about the changes in the current wages, then it will be associated with moving along the labor supply curve. So to wrap up the discussion in this part, we say that we draw the full employment line, which is a vertical line, with the vertical axis is R and the horizontal axis is Y. The point where the full employment line crossing the horizontal axis is the full employment level. So then for any shock that causes the full employment level to fall, and then it will shift the full employment line to the left. For any factor that causes the full employment level to increase, then it will cause the full employment line to shift to the right. Therefore, we say when there is shock in the labor market, it affects the labor supply and the labor demand. Then it will affect the equilibrium quantity of labor, and then it will affect the full employment output. And then when it causes it to increase, it shifts the full employment line to the right. When it causes it to fall, then it shifts the full employment line to the left. And this is the discussion related to what happened to the economy. So then this concludes the discussion we have related to the factor shifting the full employment line.